Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture for electronic music techniques. Today, as you can see, we are talking about dynamics processing, so let's go ahead and dive right in. We will define what dynamic processing is. We'll talk about some common compression controls, which is a very common form of dynamic processing, and we'll also talk about limiters, expanders, and gates to an extent and what those things have in common with compression. The most common dynamic processing functions are compressors, limiters, gates, and expanders. And as we'll see, all four of these have some degree of stuff in common with each other. And it's also worth noting that we are going to be looking at these tools entirely from a digital standpoint inside Studio One, but there are physical outboard devices that do compression, limiting, gates, and expanders, and they are mostly similar in terms of how they work and their control functions. So if you learn to use a compressor in a digital audio workstation, you'll have a good chance of knowing what a compressor does if it's a physical outboard device that's in front of you. They do usually have a similar function and similar control features. All of these techniques work via what we would call a transfer function, and that function maps one set of values to another set of values via some behind-the-scenes math. And for now, we don't need to worry about that behind-the-scenes math, but we want to have some idea of what the sort of results are of that function that's happening. We can also say that those are generally non-linear, and they can cause distortion to your audio signal. So it's worth noting that all dynamic processing runs the risk of changing your sound to some extent, potentially in a negative way, or potentially leading to a distortion that you did not intend. But if you use these things well and carefully, and if you are active in terms of your listening, you can avoid those issues. So why dynamics processing at all? Okay. The big idea here that we are talking about is to adjust the amplitude of a signal automatically. The idea being that we don't want to have some kind of audio waveform in our digital audio workstation and kind of like go through and like turn it up and then turn it down and then turn it up and then turn it down and do all that kind of work and ride the fader and punch in that automation data in read and write mode and all that stuff. That's important for a lot of options, but there are times where we just want a certain set of parameters to be applied to an entire audio file or an entire track, and it can save us a lot of time, and it can do things that we might not be able to easily accomplish manually. We can make quiet portions of a track louder without changing the already loud portions, or we can make the loud portions quieter without changing the already quiet portions. It gives us some options where certain parts of the track change while other parts do not. As the name implies, we are changing the dynamic range of our signal. So the range between the loudest loud and the quietest quiet is going to either get squashed or increase depending on the type of dynamic processing that we are doing. If we're working with compression, for example, the range between the loudest sound and the quietest sound will decrease, hence the name compression. There are multiple ways of accomplishing this. We might make the quiet portions quieter and leave the loud portions unchanged. That would be a definition of expanding or using an expander. And we also might make the loud portions quieter and leave the quiet portions unchanged, which would be compressing. So the loud portions get quieter and the parts that were already quiet stay the same. So we squash that entire dynamic range. So here's a graph of what dynamic processing could look like. In this case, I'm going to show you kind of how it could look in terms of compression. So on our x-axis, we have amplitude in, and on the y-axis, we have amplitude out. Now, we could, for example, have a linear system where, as you can see, if 12 decibels goes in, we get 12 decibels going out, or 0 dB going in leads to 0 dB going out. However, via this transfer function, which is what this graph represents, we could also have the output value change compared to the input value. So right now, this graph that we're looking at is a linear system. The value in equals the value out. That by itself doesn't do anything to our signal. There's no compression, there's no expanding. We just have 12 decibels in and 12 decibels out, or in this case, negative 12 in and negative 12 out. Our dynamic processor could perhaps have negative 12 become negative 20, and negative 24 could become negative 36, and negative 36 could become negative 60. So we send negative 12 into the compressor, and it sends negative 20 out, just as a hypothetical scenario. But this graph represents a transfer function that is usually going on behind the scenes of all of these sort of dynamic processors. This one just shows a great example of something going in at negative 12 and coming out at negative 20, but those values are arbitrary, and we can have all sorts of values go in and equal any number of possible values out based off how we set those tools and how we use those tools and what the artistic goal is of those tools. So dynamic processing, let's kind of focus on the compressor for a second. In nearly all instances of dynamic processing, there are two primary controls, and they are threshold and ratio. And those are the big ones that we really need to make sure we have correct and that we focus on. So threshold, above or below what loudness will dynamic range be changed? And ratio, how much above or below the threshold the amplitude is changed. So here's our idea, right? We have that waveform of -1 to 1 in our amplitude, right? In our waveform. And the idea being that if our signal gets loud enough to a certain point, if it gets far enough away from that zero displacement point, either above or below, if it gets too high, we just turn it down a little bit. Or if we're, seeing a volume meter that goes from -1, -infinity, all the way up to 0, maybe once it reaches -12, that's the threshold. So if the volume gets above -12, we start to bring that signal down. That's what our threshold is. It's the value of amplitude that the signal must be meeting for the dynamic processor to kick in. In this case, we can make the example of a compressor. If my amplitude gets loud enough above that threshold, we turn the volume down. The ratio is by how much we turn that volume down. So if we get above a certain amplitude, we hit that threshold of, let's say, -10, and we go 2 or 3 or 4 decibels over it, the greater the ratio, the more we're going to turn that signal down as it goes above that threshold. So here on our Studio One compressor shown on the right, we have a ratio of 2 to 1 in this instance, and then we have a threshold of -15. So most compressors you work with, and many other types of dynamic processors, will usually have this control of ratio and threshold, and those are probably the two most important values to get correct, or your compressor or other dynamic processor is not going to do the things you want it to. It's important to understand how ratio is defined to really understand compression as well as other dynamic processing. So ratio is defined by two numbers expressed as the change in amplitude of input compared to the change in amplitude of output. So as mentioned, 2 to 1. When we're working with compressors, the second value is always 1. We're saying like 2 to 1 or 4 to 1 or 8 to 1, okay? Thus, a ratio of 4 to 1 indicates that for each change of 4 dB above that threshold, only 1 dB of change will occur at the output, okay? So, a ratio is 4 to 1. Each change that is 4 dB above that threshold, let's say it's -10, let's say it's -20, it doesn't matter, only 1 dB will occur instead. So we are decreasing the amount of amplitude change. And the higher that ratio, the more we are decreasing. So if we had a ratio of 20 to 1, then that would mean that for each change of 20 decibels above the threshold, only one decibel would occur for change on the output. So we would have a really squashed signal. We would be turning down the amplitude of the input signal by a tremendous amount. So if the threshold is -24, okay, we have picked that is the value that we are going to reach. Once we hit 24, we're going to start turning down the volume. My amplitude goes in, it hits -24, that's my threshold, so now we need to start turning it down. If my ratio is 8 to 1, the dynamic range between -24 and 16 at the input will be between what at the output? Okay, so think about that for 1 second. I'm sending a signal in that goes between -24 and -16. Okay, so -24 is here, that's my threshold, and normally it gets up to -16, but we've hit that threshold with a ratio of 8 to 1. So how much will the output be scaled down by? It's going to be between -24 and -23 because we've gone 8 decibels above, so we are now scaling down by 8 decibels, and we're going to get no more than 23 decibels, -23 decibels on the output. So a ratio of 8 to 1 is actually pretty strong. Even 4 to 1 is relatively pronounced. If you're at 8 or 1 or higher, you're doing a pretty extreme amount of compression. Most compressors, and including the one in Studio One, have an upper limit, and in Studio One, 20 to 1 is as high as you can go, which is a pretty extreme amount of compression for an input signal. So then the question would be, is a ratio of 1 to 1 has what effect? So let's say you have a threshold, you've set it somewhere, and then you have a ratio of 1 to 1. What are you going to get? Well, you're going to get nothing because the value in equals the value out. A ratio of 1 to 1 is a linear system. So we are always going to need a ratio beyond 1 to 1 in order to actually decrease the volume of that incoming signal going into the compressor or the dynamic processor. And when the ratio is 1 to 1, does it matter where you set the threshold? It doesn't matter at all because you're not going to compress. Whether you cross it or not is irrelevant because once you go past that threshold, nothing is going to happen. So if your ratio is too low, such as 1 to 1 or maybe 1.1 to 1, while 1.1 to 1 will give you compression, it's going to be very, very minor. So just be aware that your ratio is tremendously important and that if you don't go beyond 1 to 1, you won't get any actual dynamic compression. Nothing is remapped via this transfer function instantaneously. All changes, they have to occur over time. Otherwise, there will be distortion and error because amplitude is a measure of change of air pressure over time. If we just instantly shift things and truncate things and turn things up, it's going to create audio artifacts and problems that we do not want. So timing is a tremendously important part of how compressors work. And most compressors include controls for how long it takes for changes to come into effect. And we call these attack time and release time. And we can see them over here on this example of the Studio One compressor. They are measured in milliseconds, and the attack time is exactly that. We go above the threshold. How long does it take the compressor to decide to start turning that thing down? If the attack time is really quick, it turns it down right away. If my attack time is really slow, it takes longer for the compressor to start compressing that signal. So a little bit more on attack time. Again, it determines the time over which the appropriate amount of gain reduction will occur. It's measured in milliseconds. So why would we want relatively short or long attack times? What would be the motivation for having a really quick attack time or a really long or slow attack time? How is that going to affect our sound, and what element of our waveform and our audio are we most concerned about when dealing with attack time? The answer is going to be our transients. And if you did not know, a transient is a high amplitude, short duration sound at the beginning of a waveform. So something like a snare drum hit where it's just like psh, and the waveform is just really tall sort of instantaneously. If we have an attack time that is not taking into account the nature of the sound that we are trying to compress, we have the potential of really ruining the transients. Those sudden attacks, they can get lost. They can get compressed too quickly, or they can get not compressed at all, depending on how we set the attack time of our compressor. There's no necessary right or wrong way to set the attack time based off what we're dealing with, but you need to be aware, and there are some standard practices that I'm not going to go into at this moment, but it's trial and error, I think, is the best thing to do. Let's say you're putting a compressor on some drums. Listen to how it sounds, and if you notice that the attack time is really long and you're not getting those transients to be sort of squashed a bit more, increase your or decrease your attack time to be something like 5 milliseconds, where it can really act really quickly. Or if perhaps your transients are starting to sort of get cut away and you're missing portions of what you want and you actually want a little more dynamic range, then increase your attack time so that it takes the compressor a little longer to start squashing your signal. That way you can still get little moments of brightness and higher transients of amplitude. In terms of release time, it's just the other side of that coin. So it takes a while to start, turning the amplitude down of that signal, and it's going to take some amount of time to release. So it determines the time over which the appropriate amount of gain reduction will cease, also measured in milliseconds. Now, why would we want relatively short or long release times? We no longer care about the onset, the attack, right? We don't care about the transient anymore because that's already happened at the beginning of the sound. What would be the motivation? What portion of the sound are we interested in terms of the release time? What do we want to make sure we don't lose? We don't want to lose the sustain. So a lot of sounds might sustain for some amount of time. They might continue. Maybe it's a really reverberant, resonant sound, or it's a tone that's just continuing after that attack. And if our release time is improper, we could either have the release of that sound kind of get really loud all of a sudden when we didn't want it to, or it could just sort of taper off the face of the earth and go away because we're no longer using the compressor to act on it. So once again, there are some standard practices for release times based off certain types of sounds and instruments. But your ear is the best judge. Listen to how the release of your sound is being, affected by the use of your compressor. And if what you're hearing is not what you wanted, if the tail or the release or the sustain of that sound is improper compared to what you wanted, try increasing or decreasing your release time and see how it ends up sounding. And by the way, that's true really with all dynamic compression or all dynamic processing. Your ear is the best judge. You will start to develop some best practices and realize what are some common settings for ratio and threshold and attack and release time, but your ear is the best judge, and experimentation is fun, and it's really kind of fun to play around with these things and see how much it affects your sound. Knee is a control in not every compressor. We do have a knee control in Studio One, and as I mentioned here, it softens the threshold point. This becomes a little clearer when I demonstrate it in Studio One, but where that little dot is on the compressor graph that we have going on there, where we sort of have a representation of that transfer function, that dot represents the threshold, and the higher our knee value, the more we're going to kind of bend around that threshold. It's measured in dB, and it's going to gradually increase the effect of the compressor as we approach the threshold, rather than it just being like a strict line of, I'm not compressing, I'm not compressing, I'm compressing, okay? If the knee value is turned high, we sort of curve that and we go, oh, I'm compressing a little, I'm compressing a little, I'm compressing more, compressing more, compressing more, and now I'm compressing at the threshold value. So it can kind of soften the approach to that compressor as your audio goes into the system. It's worth noting that not all compressors have this function, both physical ones and digital ones. I like the one in Studio One because it does have this control, and I often like to have that value increased so that I actually do have that sort of softening around that threshold, just for my own personal taste and aesthetic. I like that sort of sound that I get out of the compressor with a relatively high knee value. Depends on what I'm working with. If it's something like drums, I might not want that, but again, context matters, as does your ears and how things sound to you. So moving slightly into a different direction, but really in the same avenue, is the idea of a limiter. And limiters essentially function the same as compressors, but with a different purpose. Limiters are used to define the absolute maximum amplitude of an audio signal. So compressors just squash a signal, but a limiter says this is the loudest you can get and nothing else, okay? They can help us avoid clipping. That doesn't mean they're just going to make our audio that would normally clip sound good. I know some people that have done some horrible mixes that would just be clipping by 1,000 dB on the master output. And they're like, you know what? Let's slap a limiter on it, set it to 0. Nothing can go above 0, and my audio is perfect and it sounds amazing. That's not how limiters work. You don't just want to slap a limiter on and just bring all this gratuitous amount of signal down. You have to be careful. But that is the function of it, is that it can help avoid clipping and can set your maximum amplitude possible. Some limiters, as well as compressors, employ a technique called look-ahead to allow the function to more effectively adjust the incoming amplitude, which is really great. It will look slightly ahead in the waveform, and if it sees a really big peak coming, it's going to take that into account and adjust its controls accordingly so that it's going to really limit that thing before it's already there, and so that we don't end up actually getting any real sort of peaking from that limiter. So a limiter is kind of like a roided out compressor, in that it does that one thing, and it really does that one thing really well. So some parameters of that limiter, we're going to have the threshold, which is the same as a compressor. Once we reach that threshold, that's where the limiter starts acting and turning down the signal. The ratio, it's the same as with a compressor, but it's usually at infinity to 1, and it's often not adjustable. So you may see a parameter for ratio in a limiter, but you likely won't. And in fact, some digital audio workstations, I think Pro Tools doesn't have a limiter plugin. I think it just has the compressor plugin, and you just turn the ratio all the way up to like infinity to 1. And if your ratio is infinity to 1, that just creates a hard line. So our signal reaches that threshold, and rather than going over it and being turned down and scaled downward by some amount, it just doesn't let it cross that thing, because that threshold, that ratio at the threshold is now infinity to 1. It just stops it, and it truncates the absolute maximum peak of your amplitude. Attack times are often very fast, and they also might not be controllable. The one in Studio One does not have an attack time control. It's almost instantaneous. If something reaches that threshold, it just truncates it down right away. Release times vary. They can also be short. In the case of Studio One, we do have a release control, so you can adjust that depending on how it's affecting the sound of your incoming versus outcoming signal, but just know that you might not see that on every compressor. And then we also have ceiling, and you might not see ceiling in every limiter. It seems like ceiling and threshold would be the same thing, right? The threshold is the amplitude we get to, and then we can't go above that. The ceiling means the absolute loudest sound you can possibly have come out of that limiter. So it's possible that we may want to have the threshold at one value and the ceiling at another, or we might just want to bring the ceiling down to like -6 and then have a threshold that acts accordingly so that our overall maximum amplitude is controlled. So the threshold is the point at which the limiter begins acting. The ceiling is the absolute loudest thing that can come out of that limiter. So oftentimes these values are the same, and sometimes you won't even see the ceiling control. And if you don't see one, or if you don't know what to do with it, just go ahead and leave it at 0 or leave it at the same value as your threshold, and you're going to get good results. Input is going to boost the gain of the input signal. So this is very useful for us. If we are sending something into our limiter and we set our threshold at 0, we can increase that input knob and just make our signal louder. It's going to act like a compressor. We send a louder signal in, and then we truncate the loudest points, in this case very strictly. And compressors also have input gain or makeup gain. That's how we use compressors to make things louder, because compressors by default, they just shrink your dynamic range. But if you add input gain, gain, then you just move the whole signal up, or output gain. It can be either at the beginning or the end. But the idea is that the more gain you add either at the input or output, you increase the overall amplitude of your signal versus just decreasing the range. So a great way to think about compressors and limiters is they decrease your dynamic range, and then we boost the whole signal up accordingly to make things louder, because quite often the goal with compressors is to achieve overall greater amounts of loudness, but by default that's not what they really do. We have to make sure gain is part of the equation. In terms of expanders and gates, they function similarly to compressors and limiters, but the functionality is reversed. They will usually have similar controls, but when an audio signal is below a threshold, gain reduction occurs. So rather than getting above that point, once the signal gets quiet enough, then we decrease it. So in that case, we're actually expanding the dynamic range. Quiet sounds will get quieter, or they could be removed entirely. And as you can see here in Studio One, we do have separate tools for the compressor, the expander, the limiter, and the gate. In some digital audio workstations you work with, you might find that all or some permutation of these tools are sort of combined into one, because you can often, via the parameters and via some options, sort of have them all function as one tool or plugin. I kind of like that they're discrete tools in Studio One. It just kind of works with how I like to handle signal chain and one thing after another, but just don't be surprised if you see some of this functionality combined into one tool, either in software or hardware. You can have a device that does compression and limiting and expanding just kind of all at once, and it just sort of goes through one module at a time, and they have similar controls. Expanders increase the dynamic range. Gates silence a signal when it falls below a specific threshold. So the expander, right, we have our threshold and then our audio gets below it, so it gets turned down further. With gates, when the audio gets below that threshold, we just turn the signal off. It's a really great way to get rid of like room tone or spaces between words. It's often used in like dialogue editing for motion picture, where we just don't want all that space between words. So even right now, if I stop talking, there's room noise. There's a fan running in this room. My computer is running. There's noise going on in here. We could use a gate to say any sounds below a certain threshold, and we suddenly just get rid of all that sound. Expanders take the sound below that threshold and simply turn it down even further. If we turn it down all the way, we basically have what is acting as a gate. Some other dynamic processors to be aware of: there is a deesser. That's going to be gain reduction for the sibilant range of speech, and sibilants are consonants of higher amplitude and pitch made by directing a stream of air with the tongue towards the teeth, kind of like that sort of stuff. And quite often we might not want a lot of that in our recordings. It can sound unpleasant, and it can be emphasized by our audio systems and our microphones. So a deesser is going to do gain reduction just for the range of human speech where those sibilant sounds are going to come out. So it's basically a very specific form of compressor. Now, we also might see a maximizer. A maximizer really is a limiter, but it has automatic makeup gain, and it's really designed to overall increase loudness. So it has this threshold, it has this limit, right? Probably right at 0 dB or very close to it. And anytime a signal gets close to it, that's great, but it's gonna boost everything and really try to get as much signal as possible close to that limit throughout the entire process via look ahead and all sorts of other features. And some maximizers are really advanced in the way they look at your audio to try to really boost things. Some sound like garbage, so just be careful with maximizers, and don't make the mistake of thinking, I threw a maximizer on my track, I'm good, ready to go. It made it all loud. You got to use your ears, and you have to be diligent, and you have to be careful. Just some parting thoughts on this before we dive into the software side of things. Dynamic range is good. Don't feel like having a loud sound and a quiet sound is bad. A loud sound sounds loud because it was next to a quiet sound. So comparison is really important, and your moments of loudness and your arrival points can really be accentuated and made more impactful and powerful and dramatic and musically interesting because they are next to quiet points. So don't feel like you have to just squash all dynamic range on every track, and for your whole project, dynamic range is good and it makes music really enjoyable to listen to. Reminder, compressing something doesn't make it louder, it makes it have less of a dynamic range. That's all it really does. I don't even really want to say it makes it quieter. It just decreases your dynamic range by default. You need input or output or makeup gain, depending on what you call it or where it is in the signal chain, to boost that whole signal, and I will show you that in Studio One in a moment. Compressing something doesn't make it sound better, okay? I mean, it can, but it doesn't automatically do that. And don't think that, oh, I recorded something and the first step I should do is compress it. You might not need to. In fact, I quite often don't compress a lot of stuff that some of my colleagues might. I kind of like the natural sound of stuff. Or I'll do what's called parallel compression, where I compress a signal and play it alongside its original signal, and I kind of get the best of both worlds. Overly compressing or limiting your material can cause it to sound terrible and distorted, even if you aren't clipping on the meters. That's what I was saying before. If your project would normally, just with all of your tracks are peaking and they're summing to the master mix and they're all peaking and it just sounds horrible, and you put a limiter on it to just turn things down, you're still gonna get garbage sounding audio, so you still have to be diligent and careful and practiced with the mixing of your signal. Or another good way to think about it is if your mix doesn't sound good before you put a compressor or limiter on the final bus, it's not going to sound good just because you added those things. Those things can do some great ways to help make it sound overall louder and bring some things out and maybe make it sound better, but it should still sound good without those tools. So with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and look at some of the tools in Studio One that we can use for dynamic processing. All right, so as you can see here, I have a session in Studio One and I have this little synth pad soloed. So let's just go ahead and hear what I am working with. So our goal today is to demonstrate the use of a compressor on this track as well as a limiter on my master output. So let's go ahead and go back to this track number 3, which I have soloed, and let's go to Inserts. And under PreSonus, we will have their built-in compressor. Now, as mentioned, we do also have things like the gate, and we do also have things like the expander, but we're just gonna focus on the compressor for the moment. Now, you'll notice this default pull-down menu right here where we can choose from different presets. And most synths and effects in most digital audio workstations come with some built-in presets with recommendations for how to accomplish certain tasks. And they can be a great place to start, and sometimes that's all you need to do. Just for kicks, let's go to instruments, and I don't know, this is something, it's not an electric piano exactly, but let's just load the electric piano preset, and now we can see a recommended control of like ratio and threshold and knee and attack and release. I'm not saying that this is the right way to go, but sometimes this can be a really good starting point, and then you can listen, and now we're gonna be able to hear this compressor acting in real time, though I think it's gonna be pretty subtle based off this ratio and based off where my metering is going to take me. So as you can see, this meter right here is showing the amount of gain that is being reduced on the output. So the more full this meter gets, the more we are reducing. This little dot right here represents my threshold that we have to cross. And if I lower this value, you can see that my threshold gets lower and lower. And as mentioned, this value is knee, which softens the approach to that threshold. Let's leave that pretty hard just for the moment. You'll notice we do have a look ahead option, which we can turn on or off. I usually leave it on because I usually want my compressor to be looking ahead for particular peaks. And then my ratio determines how much I truncate signal above that threshold. And I like this visual representation where we really see how we're going to flatten audio above that point. Let's just demonstrate something on the sort of extreme side to show you what I'm talking about. Let's set a really low threshold of like -30. So the sound doesn't have to get loud at all for the compressor to start working. And let's do a ratio of like 12:1 or 11.9:1, which is going to be pretty extreme. I could type in 12:1 if I wanted. If I want to get it exactly, these will respond to typing. And in addition to actually being able to visually see a lot of what's going on here, let's listen. Okay, so that doesn't sound very good anymore. You can also visually see a lot going on in compression. Another really useful function in Studio One, and most audio workstations can do this, if I right-click on this audio region, I have the option to bounce to new track. So it is going to render that audio, send it to a new track, mute the original track, and we're actually going to see a new waveform that takes into account any effects that were on that track when I bounced it. So let's just do that. And you'll notice that now look at these waveforms side by side, the original, and now look at this one. Look how tiny that got, because compression, again, really makes things quieter. That's its default function. But you'll also notice that the range between the sort of peaks and troughs of this waveform, they're really minimal. The distance between quiet and loud, quiet and loud has decreased. We've squashed this waveform tremendously because I was doing a ridiculous amount of compression with a really low threshold and a really high ratio, and it's going to sound like that. Okay, so not ideal. I'm going to go ahead and undo that bounce to that selection. And let's go ahead and try to do a slightly more sensible control to my compressor. Let's experiment a little. Let's actually, one of the things I like to do is just look at my track first. I'm going to turn off this compressor and watch my metering. you can actually see that I'm not getting much higher than about, I don't know, like -12. Let's go ahead and expand my meter and just see a little bit more here. So if I wanted to compress this track just a little, maybe a threshold between -24 and 12 is going to get me kind of where I want. Yeah. So let's set a threshold of -20 instead, a little bit more reasonable so that the compressor doesn't kick in quite so early. And let's do a ratio of 4:1, which is always, I think, a really good place to start. And let's do a relatively weak value for knee. Now, as mentioned, I can increase the input gain and just boost the whole signal. So this meter is going to be really high if I do that, or I could leave the input gain back to 0. There's also this other gain option, and I'm going to highly recommend you always turn off this auto gain button and instead choose how much gain on the output you are going to send. Also, I don't often use input gain going into the compressor. I will usually compress and then use output gain to boost the whole signal. So if I am setting my threshold at -20 and my ratio of 4:1, if I add, I don't know, let's do about 6 dB of gain, I'm now going to squash my signal a little and increase the entire thing. Let's do an attack time just a little bit longer, about 16, and you know, the release seems absolutely fine at 50 milliseconds, and let's see what this is looking like and sounding like. Okay, so that's a reasonable amount of compression, and it is potentially getting me a result that might be ideal. Let's go ahead and just bounce this to a new track to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So you'll notice that overall, my amplitude amount, my output has decreased, so a case could be made that I could boost this gain even further if I wanted, but I now have a nice audio signal that has less of a dynamic range, and the distance between peaks and troughs is smaller, which might let me mix it more easily with other signals. And that's one of the things that you want to hold on to, that compression is a tool that can help you mix multiple signals together by keeping their dynamic range in check. So I want you to explore and use this compressor, and it is required on your upcoming audio project to have a compressor on at least one track. And all your goal is to decrease the dynamic range of that track, potentially boost it a little, and let it sit in your mix a little more nicely, whether that's more prominent or whether it's further back because it's compressed. It really depends on the context. So there's no real right or wrong way to go about that right now, but I want you to experiment and see what kind of results you can get. The other thing to show at the moment is the limiter on the output. So I'm just going to undo the bounce to that track just so we get rid of that, and we still have our original track here, which is compressed. I'm going to go over here to Insert on my master bus. As a reminder, I'm not going to do it in the post section because I want this effect to occur before the master fader, and I'm going to go to our limiter. This limiter can also boost the overall input. As mentioned, we can control the ceiling, which is the absolute loudest thing that we can control, and we also have the threshold. So when does this thing start to kick in, as well as the release time. The release time is usually pretty fast. We can go all the way up to 3 seconds, which is really a long time. I'm going to leave it maybe closer to, 95. That seems fine. By the way, as a reminder, we also have presets for here, so we could just do like -1 dB limiting. We could also do something like extreme gain, where we do a huge boost. This might sound terrible. Let's go ahead and listen just for kicks. So you'll notice we are not clipping because we have this threshold and this ceiling that do not allow us to go above 0 and reach our actual clipping point. It doesn't necessarily sound great, but this actually is not as bad as I was expecting. Or maybe, I don't know, pressing. So in that case, our threshold's a little lower, so it's acting a little bit more like a compressor. If we just go back to the default, a couple of things that I would recommend you do with this limiter. One, I would make sure that this little true peak button is turned on. So true peak limiting takes into account the distance between samples, because it's possible that in the digital world, your waveform will look like it's not clipping because it's not going above your threshold at any one given sample to sample. But when we render that out to audio, sometimes it needs to interpolate the data between those different samples, and we can actually end up exceeding our theoretical maximum. So true true peak limiting helps prevent that. And then I usually end up setting my threshold to -1 and my ceiling to -1, so that I'm not necessarily reaching that, sorry, I think I typed -2, -1, so that I'm not necessarily reaching that absolute maximum, and it helps me also prevent the risk of peaking in the actual analog world versus the digital world. So if I were to do this and then maybe just do an overall boost of maybe not quite as aggressive as before, but maybe like 6.12 dB. So this is with the limiter on versus off. And that is something else that you are required to do for your upcoming project, is to have a limiter on the master output. You can determine how much input gain, but if you do too much, it will sound like garbage. Okay. And additionally, these are just different forms of metering to show you, so they don't actually affect your sound. But if you know a little bit about different forms of metering, which we can talk about in the future, but I think this peak RMS is a great way to stay for the time being. But again, I think your ears are very useful. So that is the use of a compressor on a track, as well as the limiter on the master output, both of which are requirements for your upcoming project. And we will continue to explore these processes and other similar ones in the near future.